After 30 years of serving on the federal bench, I had earned my peace. I had seen enough conflict in my courtroom to last several lifetimes. Drug cartels, organized crime syndicates, corrupt politicians. I had faced them all with the steady hand of justice. Now I wanted nothing more than tranquility. The neighborhood I chose seemed perfect. Maple trees lined the streets, their leaves painting golden patterns across manicured lawns. Children laughed and played in cul-de-sacs while parents chatted across driveways. I purchased a modest colonial at the end of Oakwood Drive, not too ostentatious, but comfortable enough for me and occasional visits from my widowed sister and her son. I moved in quietly one Thursday, no moving trucks announcing my arrival, no welcome parties or introductions. I preferred anonymity after years of high-profile cases that sometimes brought threats to my door. Here, I was not Judge Alina Richards. I was simply Alina, the new neighbor who kept her lawn neat and her business private. 3 days after settling in, the doorbell rang. A woman stood on my porch, perfectly coiffed blonde hair framing a face frozen in what I would later recognize as her perpetual expression, smiling lips but calculating eyes. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I am Margaret Thompson, president of the Homeowners Association." I shook her hand. "Alina, thank you for the welcome." Her eyes darted past me into my foyer, assessing, judging. "I like to personally greet all new residents and provide them with our community guidelines." She thrust a thick binder into my hands. "Everything you need to know is in here. Rules, regulations, community standards. We take pride in maintaining property values." I thanked her, not yet sensing the threat behind her clipboard and forced smile. That binder sat unopened on my coffee table for exactly 3 days before the first note appeared on my door. Just a friendly reminder that trash bins must be stored out of street view within 12 hours of collection. The words, "friendly reminder," were underlined twice. I complied. I moved the bins to the side yard, hidden behind latticework. Peace was worth minor accommodations. 2 days later, another note. "Mailbox height appears to be 41 inches. HOA standard is 45 inches. Please adjust accordingly." Again, I complied. I spent my Saturday afternoon digging out and resetting my mailbox post, measuring the height with a level to ensure precise compliance. The adjustments continued. My porch light was excessively bright. My garden hose was improperly stored. Each violation came with its own carefully typed notice and reference to specific page numbers in the HOA Bible she had delivered. I had faced down hardened criminals without flinching, but this woman was beginning to get under my skin. Still, I maintained my composure. I had no desire to make waves. I simply wanted to exist peacefully in my retirement. Then came the Friday evening when Margaret herself appeared at my door, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Alina, your lawn is currently 3.2 inches tall. The maximum permitted height is 2.75 inches. I must issue you a formal warning." I looked at my lawn, then back at her. "I mowed 3 days ago." "Perhaps your mower settings need adjustment," she said, making a note on her clipboard. "You have 24 hours to correct the violation before a fine is issued." As she turned to leave, something in me stirred, that same instinct that had served me well in the courtroom. I watched her walk away, clipboard held like a weapon, and I made a decision. I began documenting everything, dates, times, photographs, copies of every notice, not out of paranoia but professional habit. Evidence matters. Facts matter. I did not know then how valuable that documentation would become, or that Margaret's petty power plays were just the beginning of what would become an all-out assault on my right to peaceful enjoyment of my home. The sound of Margaret's heels clicking along the sidewalk became the soundtrack of my discontent. She patrolled the neighborhood with ruthless precision, her clipboard an extension of her arm. I came to recognize her schedule: Monday mornings for trash bin inspections, Wednesday afternoons for lawn height checks, and surprise weekend visits to catch unsuspecting homeowners in the act of unauthorized gardening or home improvement. I reread the HOA manual cover to cover, determined to stay one step ahead. I followed every rule to the letter, but compliance only seemed to intensify her scrutiny. 6 weeks after moving in, I painted my mailbox. I used the exact shade of navy blue specified in the manual, purchased directly from the hardware store list included in the HOA-approved vendors section. I even waited for optimal weather conditions to ensure a perfect finish. The next morning, an official violation notice was taped to my door. Unauthorized mailbox color, in violation of Article 7, Section 3, fine, $150. I photographed the violation notice, then my mailbox, then the relevant section in the manual, and finally, my receipt for the HOA-approved paint. I placed these documents in a folder and walked the 2 blocks to Margaret's house. She opened the door, surprise briefly flickering across her face before her customary smile appeared. "Eleanor, what can I do for you?" I held out the folder. There must be some mistake. My mailbox is painted with the approved color from the approved vendor. She took the folder but did not open it. "The board has determined the color appears inconsistent with neighborhood standards." "The board, or just you, Margaret?" Her smile tightened. "I would watch that tone. The HOA has broad discretion in these matters. The fine stands." As I turned to leave, she added, "Oh, and Eleanor, confrontational behavior is noted in resident files." I paid the fine, not because I believed it was legitimate, but because I was building my case methodically. Every unjust fine was another brick in the foundation of what would eventually become her downfall. The following weekend, my sister Patricia came to visit with her 14-year-old son, Daniel. Patricia had been struggling since losing her husband to cancer 2 years prior, and these visits were bright spots for both of them. Daniel was a quiet, thoughtful boy who spent most of his visit reading on my porch swing. Margaret noticed their presence immediately. I watched from my kitchen window as she slowed her walk past my house, making notes on her clipboard. Monday morning brought another notice: unauthorized long-term guests, violation of residency restrictions, fine, $250. I called the number on the notice. Margaret herself answered. "My sister and nephew visited for 2 days, I explained calmly. "They are not long-term guests." "They were observed on the property for more than 48 consecutive hours, she replied. "That constitutes extended residency according to our bylaws." "They arrived Saturday morning and left Sunday evening." "Not according to my observations." "Are you monitoring my home, Margaret?" A pause. "I monitor all properties for compliance." Later that week, I overheard a neighbor mentioning that Margaret had warned her about the new rental situation on Oakwood Drive, and how those people might affect property values. The implication was clear. She was spreading false information about me throughout the neighborhood. I attempted to attend the monthly HOA meeting to address these concerns formally. When I arrived at the community center, Margaret and 5 other board members sat at a long table. Chairs had been arranged for residents, but only 3 others had shown up. "We would like to address the agenda items first," Margaret announced when I raised my hand. "Resident concerns will be addressed at the end of the meeting if time permits." For 2 hours, I sat through discussions of landscaping quotes and community pool regulations. When they finally reached resident concerns, Margaret looked at her watch. "It appears we are out of time. Please submit any concerns in writing for consideration at next month's meeting." As the room emptied, I approached one of the other board members, a tall man with gray hair who had remained quiet throughout the meeting. "Excuse me." Margaret appeared between us. "Robert has a prior commitment, Eleanor. As I said, please submit your concerns in writing." It was only later that I discovered Robert was Margaret's husband, a fact never disclosed in any HOA materials, a clear conflict of interest. The harassment intensified. My garbage cans were reported as being rolled out too early or brought in too late, even when I had proof otherwise. One neighbor confided that she had received similar treatment after declining to support Margaret's bid for HOA presidency 2 years prior. "Most of us just keep our heads down," she whispered, constantly glancing toward Margaret's house. "It is not worth the fight." But to me, justice was always worth the fight. I had spent my career ensuring that power was not abused. I would not stand by while this neighborhood tyrant transformed a community into her personal kingdom. Every case I had ever presided over began with research, evidence, facts, the very foundations of justice. Now I found myself assembling a different kind of case file, one where I was both investigator and plaintiff. I started with the HOA bylaws, not the simplified handbook distributed to residents, but the actual legal documents filed with the county. I drove to the recorder's office and requested copies of everything: the original articles of incorporation, amendments, financial filings, board meeting minutes for the past 5 years. What I found disturbed me professionally and infuriated me personally. The bylaws gave the board authority to issue warnings for violations, but specific procedures had to be followed before fines could be levied. A written warning, a hearing opportunity, a formal vote by the board. None of these procedures had been followed in my case, or, I suspected, in anyone else's. The financial statements revealed more troubling patterns. The HOA collected approximately $125,000 annually in dues from the 94 homes in our community. The budget allocated these funds for landscaping, snow removal, community pool maintenance, and a modest reserve fund. But nearly $30,000 each year was categorized simply as administrative expenses with no further breakdown. More concerning were the fines. Over the past year, the HOA had collected $42,750 in violation fines, an astonishing amount for a small community. These funds were not properly documented in the financial statements. They appeared to exist in a separate account to which only Margaret and her husband Robert had access. I began discreetly interviewing neighbors. Most were reluctant to speak at first, eyes darting nervously toward Margaret's house at the end of the cul-de-sac. But gradually, their stories emerged. The Jacobsons had been fined $500 for installing a basketball hoop that had actually been approved by the previous board. The Wilsons received weekly violations after questioning the pool closure schedule. The Mendozas eventually sold their home at a loss after months of harassment over their ethnic garden decorations. "We could not take it anymore," Mrs. Mendoza told me when I called her at her new address. "The constant notices, the way she would stand in front of our house taking pictures. My children were afraid to play in our own yard." I learned that 3 board members had resigned over the past 2 years, all replaced by Margaret's close friends without proper elections. Her husband Robert, technically serving as board treasurer, signed off on all financial decisions. The most damning evidence came from Elaine Chen, who had served as board secretary before being forced out. "Margaret changed meeting minutes after I had drafted them," she revealed. "She removed objections, altered vote counts. When I confronted her, I was accused of violating confidentiality and pushed to resign." Elaine provided me with her original notes from 6 meetings, clearly showing discrepancies between what had actually occurred and what had been officially recorded. I installed security cameras around my property, not just for protection but for evidence. I recorded every interaction with Margaret and any board member. I kept meticulous records of every notice, every fine, every false claim. What emerged was not just a pattern of petty tyranny, but systematic abuse of power and potential financial impropriety. Margaret had created a shadow government within our community, one that operated by fear rather than proper procedure. The more I discovered, the more residents began to trust me. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox with additional information. One contained internal emails showing Margaret instructing board members to target specific residents who had questioned her authority. Another neighbor revealed that her daughter's graduation party had been shut down by Margaret calling the police, falsely claiming noise violations, revenge for the family's complaint about improper pool maintenance. I was not just building a case anymore. I was uncovering a years-long pattern of abuse that had broken apart what should have been a thriving community. Neighbors avoided eye contact with each other. Children played indoors instead of on pristine lawns for fear of violations. People lived in constant anxiety about the next knock on the door, the next notice, the next confrontation. This was no longer just about my right to peace. This was about restoring justice to an entire neighborhood held hostage by one woman's unchecked power. The first sign that Margaret had discovered my investigation came in the form of a certified letter. Notice of disruptive behavior and community standards violation, the heading read. The letter accused me of creating community discord and harassing board members with unfounded accusations. It warned that continued behavior could result in legal action by the HOA. I folded the letter carefully and added it to my growing file of evidence. Then I continued my work. 3 days later, my sister Patricia called in tears. "Eleanor, Margaret just called Daniel's school. She told them he vandalized property in the neighborhood when he visited last weekend, and they called me in for a meeting." My blood ran cold. Daniel was with us the entire time. "I know, he never even left your yard except when we went to that restaurant on Saturday. How could she do this?" The principal was talking about community service hours and restitution. I assured Patricia I would handle it. Fortunately, my security cameras had captured the entirety of Daniel's visit, showing him reading on my porch or playing chess with me in the living room. I compiled the footage, along with our restaurant receipts showing our whereabouts, and sent it to the school principal with a formal letter identifying myself as a federal judge and Daniel's aunt. The principal called me directly the next day. "Judge Richards, I had no idea. Mrs. Thompson presented herself as the Neighborhood Association president with a formal complaint. We take vandalism seriously, but your evidence clearly shows your nephew was not involved." "And what exactly was vandalized?" I asked. A pause. According to Mrs. Thompson, a decorative fountain in her front yard was damaged. She claimed to have witnessed your nephew running from the scene. Pure fabrication. A new low even for Margaret, targeting a child to get to me. When I returned home that evening, I found a white envelope taped to my door. No HOA letterhead this time. Inside was a typewritten note. "Mind your own business or things will get worse. Not everyone is protected by cameras." The threat was clear. I reported it to local police and installed additional security measures. The following week brought an official HOA statement to all residents about disturbing investigations being conducted by a new resident with questionable motives. The letter, signed by the entire board, claimed I had been harassing long-standing community members and demanded I cease or face expulsion from the community. No such provision for expulsion existed in the bylaws, but truth had long since ceased to matter in Margaret's kingdom. Then came the financial assault. I received a bill claiming I owed $4,750 in unpaid dues and accumulated fines. I had paid my dues on time and had receipts for every fine I had been unjustly charged, totaling nowhere near that amount. When I called the number on the letter, Robert answered. "There appears to be an accounting error," I said calmly. "No error," he replied. "The board has conducted a full audit of your account. Payment is due in full within 15 days, or we will place a lien on your property." I was dealing with people who believed themselves untouchable, who had operated with impunity for years against neighbors too intimidated to fight back. The final straw came when I returned from grocery shopping to find my mailbox smashed, the post splintered as if struck by something heavy. As I examined the damage, Margaret appeared at the end of my driveway. "Such a shame," she said, not bothering to hide her smirk. "Teenagers these days have no respect for property. You should file a police report." I looked directly into her eyes. "I believe I will." That evening, I reviewed my security footage. At 1:47 p.m., while I was at the store, a car had stopped in front of my house. Robert Thompson had emerged, looked around quickly, then struck my mailbox repeatedly with what appeared to be a baseball bat before driving away. I had faced intimidation before. Death threats from drug lords, attempted bribes from wealthy defendants, but never had I encountered such brazen pettiness cloaked in suburban propriety. The time for quiet investigation was over. Margaret had escalated from harassment to criminal behavior. She had targeted my family. She had crossed every line. It was time to reveal exactly who she had chosen as her enemy. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. I arrived early, dressed not in my usual casual retirement attire, but in the crisp, authoritative suit I had worn on the bench for decades. With me was a leather briefcase containing everything I needed. The room filled slowly. I recognized faces from my investigations, neighbors who had shared their stories, others who had avoided eye contact out of fear. Margaret sat at the center of the table at the front, flanked by Robert and 4 other board members. She noted my presence with a slight narrowing of her eyes. "Welcome, everyone," Margaret began at precisely 7:00 p.m. "We have several important matters to discuss tonight, beginning with the landscaping contract renewal." I waited patiently through discussions of sprinkler schedules and tree trimming. When Margaret finally announced, "We have time for 1 or 2 resident concerns," I stood. "I have a matter to address," I said, walking to the front of the room. Margaret's smile was glacial. "Eleanor, residents are limited to 3 minutes for concerns." "This will take longer than 3 minutes," I replied, placing my briefcase on the table. "Then you need to submit it in writing for next month's." "Margaret Thompson," I interrupted, my voice shifting to the tone I had used in my courtroom. "I am here to present evidence of systematic abuse of power, financial impropriety, and possible criminal misconduct by the current Homeowners Association Board." The room fell silent. Margaret's face hardened. "This is inappropriate and potentially slanderous. I must ask you to—" "I am Judge Eleanor Richards," I continued, removing my federal judiciary identification and placing it on the table. "I have served as a federal judge for the past 30 years. I am well acquainted with the law, including HOA regulations and the limits of board authority." Gasps and murmurs spread through the room. Margaret's face drained of color. "This is ridiculous," Robert sputtered. "You cannot come in here and—" "I can and I will," I said, opening my briefcase. "I have spent the past 3 months compiling evidence of misconduct that would be of great interest to the Attorney General's office." I began methodically laying out documents on the table. First, the matter of improper fine assessment. HOA bylaws require a specific process before fines can be levied. None of these procedures have been followed in dozens of cases I have documented. I distributed copies of the bylaws with relevant sections highlighted, alongside a spreadsheet detailing violations of procedure. Second, financial irregularities. The board has collected over $40,000 in fines in the past year alone. This money has not been properly accounted for in HOA financial statements. It appears to have been diverted to an account accessible only to Margaret and Robert Thompson. Robert attempted to gather the papers I was distributing. "This is confidential information." "Actually, it is public record," I corrected him. "All HOA financial statements must be made available to homeowners by law. The fact that you have concealed them is another violation." Margaret stood, her voice shrill. "This meeting is adjourned. Everyone needs to leave immediately." No one moved. "Additionally," I continued, "I have documented numerous instances of selective enforcement, harassment, and retribution against residents who questioned board decisions." I nodded to several neighbors who had shared their stories with me. One by one, they stood. "The Thompsons threatened to fine me daily if I did not remove my daughter's medical equipment from view," said Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly woman whose grandchild used a wheelchair. "Margaret told me my children could not play in the front yard because they were too noisy," added Mr. Kozlowski. "She reported my business to the city claiming I was operating illegally, when I only work from home at my computer," said Ms. Rivera. More residents stood. More stories emerged. 30 years of courtroom experience had taught me that once the first person finds courage, others follow. The dam of fear had broken. Margaret's composure cracked entirely. "You are all ungrateful. I have dedicated my life to maintaining this community's standards. Without me, this neighborhood would fall apart." "Most seriously," I continued, "I have evidence of criminal activity." I played the security footage showing Robert vandalizing my mailbox. Destruction of male receptacles is a federal offense. The room erupted in shock. I have already forwarded all evidence to the Attorney General's office, the postal inspector, and local law enforcement, I announced. A formal investigation into the HOA's practices will begin next week. Margaret grabbed her purse and stalked toward the door, Robert trailing behind her. At the threshold, she turned back. "This is not over," she hissed. "Actually, Margaret," I replied calmly, "for you it is." After they left, I addressed the remaining residents. For too long, this community has lived under fear rather than governance. That ends today. I propose an emergency election for an interim board to manage affairs until a proper investigation is completed. Hands rose throughout the room. Volunteers stepped forward. For the first time since I had moved in, I saw genuine smiles on my neighbors' faces. Not the forced, fearful smiles of those under tyranny, but the relieved expressions of people finally free. The wheels of justice often turn slowly, but when properly set in motion, they are impossible to stop. Within 1 week of the meeting, county officials had launched a formal investigation into the HOA's financial practices. 2 weeks later, cease and desist orders were issued against Margaret and Robert, prohibiting them from representing themselves as board officers or conducting any HOA business. The interim board, elected that night at the community center, began the painstaking process of reviewing years of questionable decisions. Every fine was examined against proper procedures. Residents who had been unjustly penalized received formal letters of apology and promises of restitution. The financial investigation revealed the full extent of the Thompsons' misconduct. Nearly $175,000 had been diverted from legitimate HOA accounts over 5 years, money collected through excessive fines, inflated vendor contracts with kickback provisions, and misappropriated dues. The funds had financed the Thompsons' luxury car, exotic vacations, and extensive home renovations. Criminal charges followed. Robert faced multiple counts of financial fraud, destruction of federal property, and filing false police reports. Margaret was charged with fraud, intimidation, and misappropriation of funds. Their house went on the market, listed well below market value for a quick sale. They moved out under cover of darkness, leaving behind a shell of what had once been their fortress of power. The transformation within the community was remarkable. The next official HOA meeting drew nearly every household, not out of fear, but genuine interest in rebuilding. New bylaws were drafted with clear limits on board authority and robust protection for homeowners' rights. Procedures for fines included multiple checks and balances. Financial transparency became mandatory, with quarterly reports available to all residents. I watched from the back of the room as neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now chatted openly, sharing ideas for community improvements. Children played on front lawns without parents anxiously watching for Margaret's patrol. Gardens flourished with personal touches that might have once triggered violation notices. "Judge Richards," Mrs. Chen approached me after the meeting, "we have unanimously voted to offer you a position on the new permanent board." I smiled but shook my head. "I am honored, but my role was to restore justice, not to govern. This community needs to move forward with fresh leadership. I am happy to serve as an advisor when needed." The court-mandated restructuring continued for 6 months. Every resident received reimbursement for unjust fines. The diverted funds, once recovered through asset seizure, funded long-neglected community improvements, new playground equipment, repairs to the swimming pool, and landscaping for common areas. Most importantly, the culture of fear dissipated. Neighbors began to trust again, not just the board, but each other. Block parties emerged spontaneously. Residents shared tools, recipes, childcare. The neighborhood transformed from a collection of isolated homes into a true community. The legal proceedings against the Thompsons concluded with guilty pleas and restitution orders. Neither would serve on an HOA board again. Their fall from power became a cautionary tale for other communities, leading to state legislative reforms strengthening oversight of homeowners' associations. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through the patient, methodical application of law and truth. The very principles I had upheld throughout my career had transformed my retirement community into the peaceful haven I had originally sought. 1 year after moving into Oakwood Estates, I sat on my front porch swing watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in golden hues. Children played tag on the community green. Neighbors walked dogs, stopping to chat without nervous glances over their shoulders. My garden flourished with flowers that might once have been deemed non-standard under the old regime. My mailbox, rebuilt and painted a shade of blue slightly different from the one in the handbook, stood unmolested at the end of my driveway. Patricia and Daniel visited regularly now. My nephew had grown fond of helping me tend my vegetable garden, learning patience and care from nurturing seedlings into harvest. This weekend, he had invited 3 friends for a campout in my backyard, something unimaginable during Margaret's reign. "Judge Richards," Mrs. Abernathy called, wheeling her granddaughter up my front walk. "We brought you some of our fresh-baked sourdough." I welcomed them onto my porch, accepting the warm loaf. "Eleanor, please, I am not on the bench anymore." "You will always be Judge Richards to us," she replied with a smile. "You brought justice when we had forgotten what it looked like." Many residents expressed similar sentiments. Though I had declined formal leadership positions, I had become something of an unofficial community advisor. Neighbors sought my input on interpretation of the new bylaws. Young families asked for guidance navigating school systems. Even teenagers occasionally appeared on my doorstep seeking advice about college applications or career paths. I had not expected this kind of connection when I purchased this house seeking solitude. Yet I found myself embracing this new role, not as an authority figure, but as a trusted neighbor. The new HOA board functioned as it should, as administrative caretakers rather than power-hungry enforcers. Meetings were conducted with transparency. Decisions were made through genuine consensus. When violations did occur, they were addressed with respect and reasonable accommodation. One quiet Sunday morning, I noticed a moving truck in front of what had once been the Thompsons' house. The new owners, a young couple with twin toddlers, looked nervous as they directed movers carrying furniture. I walked over with a basket containing a loaf of bread, local honey, and a copy of the new community guidelines. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates," I said, extending my hand. "I am Eleanor Richards, your neighbor down the street." Relief washed over their faces. Later, they confessed they had heard stories about the neighborhood's strict reputation and had been prepared for immediate criticism of their children's play equipment. That evening, watching fireflies dance above my lawn, I reflected on the nature of justice. In my courtroom, I had dealt with the aftermath of injustice, punishing wrongs already committed. Here, I had helped prevent future harms by dismantling a system that enabled abuse. Near the oldest oak tree in my backyard, I had placed a small garden stone engraved with the words that had guided my career: "Peace through justice," not as a monument to victory, but as a quiet reminder of eternal vigilance. Margaret and Robert occasionally appeared in local news as their legal troubles continued. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only relief that their capacity to harm others had been removed. The neighborhood continued to heal and grow. Property values increased not through rigid conformity, but because people genuinely wanted to live here. 3 houses sold above asking price in the spring, their new owners specifically citing the community atmosphere as their reason for choosing Oakwood Estates. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, lights came on in windows around me. Not the harsh security lights of people living in fear, but the warm glows of families gathered for dinner, friends sharing conversation, individuals pursuing hobbies and passions without worry of criticism or penalty. This was the peace I had sought when I retired from the bench. Not isolation, but connection. Not absence of conflict, but presence of harmony. Not freedom from community, but freedom within community. I had protected the law for decades. Now, in my retirement, the law had protected me, and an entire neighborhood, when we needed it most. The gavel had been set aside, but justice continued its quiet work through knowledge, courage, and the willingness to stand firm against those who would abuse power. From my porch, I raised my evening tea in a silent toast to neighbors whose faces I now knew and whose stories I had come to treasure. This was not just a place where I lived. This was home.